For most of human history, scientists believed something that turned out to be completely wrong. They believed that the adult brain was fixed, finished, set in place like concrete that had already hardened. You were born with a certain number of neurons. Those neurons formed their connections in childhood, and once you reached adulthood, that was it. What you had was what you would always have. The brain you arrived at in your 20s was essentially the brain you would die with. This belief shaped everything. It shaped how doctors treated brain injuries, with resignation rather than hope. It shaped how people understood their own limitations as permanent rather than temporary. It shaped the quiet inner narrative that millions of people carry. I am not good at this. I have never been good at this. I will never be good at this. And then, slowly, painstakingly, through decades of research that was initially dismissed and even ridiculed, a different truth emerged. The brain is not fixed. It never was. It is, in a word that has become one of the most important in modern neuroscience, plastic. Not plastic in the sense of the material, plastic in the original sense of the word, from the Greek plastikos, capable of being shaped, capable of being molded, capable of changing form in response to experience, to learning, to challenge, to practice, and even to thought itself. This is neuroplasticity, and once you truly understand it, not just intellectually, but in your bones, it changes how you see yourself, how you approach difficulty, and what you believe is possible for the rest of your life. Settle in, pour your tea, and let us think about this together. The story of neuroplasticity is also the story of how science resists ideas that threaten its established certainties. For much of the 20th century, the dominant view was clear. The brain develops in childhood. It reaches its mature state in early adulthood, and after that, it is essentially static. Individual neurons might die, connections might weaken with age or injury, but new connections forming in an adult brain, new neurons being born, fundamental reorganization of brain structure? Impossible, heretical even, to suggest otherwise. The scientists who questioned this view faced serious professional consequences. Their papers were rejected, their funding was denied, their conclusions were dismissed as wishful thinking dressed up as science. One of the most important of these scientists was a neurologist named Michael Merzenich. Working in the 1960s and 70s, Merzenich began conducting experiments on the brains of adult monkeys. He would alter their sensory input, cutting or rerouting the nerves that connected their fingers to their brains, and then observe what happened to the brain's cortical maps, the areas of the brain that correspond to different parts of the body. What he found was extraordinary. When a nerve was cut, the area that had previously processed information from that nerve did not go silent. It did not simply sit unused. It reorganized. It began processing information from neighboring areas. It adapted. It changed its fundamental structure in response to a change in experience. This was not supposed to be possible, and yet there it was, observable, measurable, undeniable. But the scientific establishment was not ready. The implications were too disruptive, too threatening to too many settled conclusions. Merzenich's work was acknowledged but largely set aside. The field moved on. And then, in the 1980s and 1990s, something happened that made setting it aside impossible. Technology caught up with the idea. Brain imaging, first with positron emission tomography and then with functional brain resonance imaging, made it possible to watch the living brain in action, to see in real time which areas were activating during different tasks, to compare the brains of experts with the brains of novices, to track what happened to brain structure over months and years of practice and learning. And what the images showed was unambiguous. The brain was changing, constantly, visibly, in response to everything it experienced. Let us look at some of what those images revealed. because the evidence for neuroplasticity is not abstract, it is concrete, it is specific, and it is deeply personally relevant to every one of us. London taxi drivers. For decades before GPS navigation existed, becoming a licensed taxi driver in London required memorizing the layout of over 25,000 streets, every road, every landmark, every shortcut. A spatial knowledge so vast and intricate that the licensing exam, known simply as the knowledge, takes most candidates between 2 and 4 years to pass. Researchers scanned the brains of licensed London taxi drivers and compared them to the brains of people who had not undergone this training. The difference was measurable and dramatic. The hippocampus, the region of the brain most closely associated with spatial memory and navigation, was significantly larger in the taxi drivers. And the longer a driver had been working, the more pronounced the difference. The brain had literally grown in response to years of intense navigational challenge, not metaphorically, physically, measurably. The demands of the work had reshaped the organ that performed it. Musicians. Violinists who began training in childhood show enlarged representation in their motor cortex of the fingers of their left hand, the hand that performs the complex, precise movements required to play the instrument. The more years of training, the more pronounced the cortical reorganization. And crucially, this reorganization is not simply the result of childhood learning being encoded during a sensitive developmental period. Adult musicians who begin training later in life show similar, if not somewhat less dramatic, reorganization. The brain, even the adult brain, responds to practice by restructuring itself to support that practice more efficiently. Stroke survivors. Perhaps the most clinically significant evidence for neuroplasticity comes from patients who have suffered strokes, events that destroy brain tissue in specific areas, often resulting in paralysis, loss of speech, or impairment of other functions. For most of the 20th century, what was lost in a stroke was considered permanently lost. The dead tissue would not regenerate, the functions it had supported would not return. But researchers working with neuroplasticity found something different. With intensive, targeted rehabilitation, with therapies specifically designed to force the brain to find new pathways, some stroke patients were able to recover functions that conventional medicine had written off as gone forever. The brain was rerouting, building new connections around the damaged areas, recruiting regions that had previously served different functions to take over the work of what had been destroyed. Not always, not completely, not without extraordinary effort and time, but enough, consistently enough to overturn the fundamental assumption that what a stroke takes, it takes permanently. Now, let us step back from the laboratory, from the taxi drivers and the violinists and the stroke patients, and let us ask what this means for you, for the life you are actually living, for the beliefs you carry about what you can and cannot do. Because I think neuroplasticity has two distinct kinds of implications, one that is liberating and one that is uncomfortable, and both of them matter equally. The liberating implication is this: you are not fixed. Whatever story you have been telling yourself about your limitations, I am not a mathematical person, I am not naturally creative, I am not good with languages, I do not have the kind of memory that retains information, I am not disciplined, I am not brave, none of these stories are descriptions of permanent biological facts. They are descriptions of current neuroconfigurations, patterns that have formed through experience and habit and repetition. And because the brain is plastic, because it changes in response to experience and habit and repetition, those configurations can change. Not instantly, not effortlessly, not without sustained practice and genuine challenge, but they can change. This is not motivational language. This is not the kind of sentiment you find on inspirational posters. This is neuroscience. The brain that exists in your skull right now is not the brain you were born with. It is the accumulated result of every experience you have had, every skill you have practiced, every habit you have formed,
every thought pattern you have repeated. It has been changing your entire life, and it will continue to change for as long as you live. The question is not whether your brain can change, it is whether the changes you are creating are the ones you actually want. And this is where the uncomfortable implication enters. If the brain changes in response to what you repeatedly do and think and experience, then it is also changing in response to what you repeatedly avoid, to the habits you maintain that you know are not serving you, to the thought patterns you return to again and again, to the fears you accommodate rather than face, to the skills you never practice because you decided early on that you were not the kind of person who would ever be good at them. Every repeated experience, useful or harmful, growth-oriented or stagnating, is carving pathways in your brain, making certain responses easier,
Making certain perceptions more automatic, making certain interpretations of reality feel like objective truth rather than habitual pattern. The anxiety that feels overwhelming, it has been practiced. Not deliberately, not consciously, but every time the brain encountered a certain type of situation and responded with fear, and every time that fear was accommodated and avoided rather than faced, the pathway deepened. The response became more automatic, more convincing, more like a fixed feature of the self rather than a learned habit of the nervous system. The same is true of pessimism, of perfectionism, of the inner critic that speaks first and loudest in response to failure. These are not personality traits you were born with. They are neural patterns that have been reinforced over time. And because they have been reinforced, they feel like truth. They feel like simply how things are. But they are plastic. They can be changed. With the right understanding and the right practice, and, most importantly, with the willingness to be a beginner, to be clumsy, to be slow, to be wrong on the way to being better. There is a principle in neuroscience that has become one of the field's most quoted statements. It was articulated by a neuropsychologist named Donald Hebb in 1949, decades before the full evidence for neuroplasticity was in, and it remains as accurate and as useful as it was the day he wrote it. Neurons that fire together, wire together. 4 words, enormous implications. When 2 neurons activate simultaneously, when they participate together in the same experience or thought or action, the connection between them strengthens. The more often they fire together, the stronger that connection becomes, until eventually the activation of one almost automatically triggers the activation of the other. This is how habits form, how skills solidify, how fears deepen, how associations become automatic, how the story you have told about yourself for years starts to feel like biological fact rather than narrative choice. And it is also, crucially, how new habits form, how new skills are built, how fears can be methodically, patiently, gradually unwired through repeated exposure to what was feared without the catastrophic outcome the brain predicted. Every time you practice something difficult, every time you push through the discomfort of not yet being good at something, you are literally changing the physical structure of your brain, creating new connections, strengthening pathways that did not previously exist, building the neural architecture for a version of yourself that does not yet fully exist, but is in the process of becoming real. This is what practice actually is. Not just the accumulation of experience, but the physical remodeling of the most complex structure in the known universe in the direction you choose, one repetition at a time. Before you leave this moment, I want to offer you something to carry. Think of one area of your life where you have accepted a story about yourself as fixed. One thing you have told yourself you simply are not or simply cannot do. Now, ask yourself, how long have you been telling that story? How many times have you repeated it? How many times have you avoided the experience that might have begun to rewrite it? And then consider this.
Every single thing you are now capable of, every skill you have, every knowledge you carry, every strength you possess, was once something you could not do, was once foreign and difficult and clumsy in your hands. Your brain learned it. Your brain changed to accommodate it. Your brain built the architecture for it, one effortful repetition at a time. It did it then. It can do it again. It is doing it right now as you listen to these words and form new connections and deepen existing ones and build, quietly, invisibly, magnificently, a slightly different version of the brain you had when this conversation began. You are not fixed. You never were. This is GreenTea English. Thank you for thinking with me today. See you in the next one.